Hi there, welcome to Shoreline Community College. If you haven't been here before, some of you were here earlier today, I think, right? Nice to see you all here on a rainy evening. My name is Tim Payne. I teach economics and international studies here at Shoreline. I have the honor of introducing our speaker tonight, Larry Doors. We share a few things in common. We're both economists. We both found out we have some background in agriculture. We both have a love for Burma as well, and it's really a pleasure to have Larry here. Larry has been here, I think, about 2 or 3 other times in the past. Student clubs here have sponsored him on campus, and so it's really great to have him here again. First of all, a few things about what we're doing tonight. Just a little bit of the format. You'll be hearing from Larry for a while, and then there'll be a chance for questions afterwards. Because this is being videotaped, we will ask everyone, if you do have a question, to get one of the microphones here from our staff, and they will run them around. So if you have a question, you can just raise your hand. We'll do that after Larry has had some things to say. I first learned about Burma almost as an accident. As a young faculty member who was teaching international economics, I found I hadn't really traveled that much. And I thought I need to go somewhere different and to get a different feel of the world. And so I was inspired to scrape the money I had together and take a trip. And I decided to hit to this part of the world. Went to Indonesia, to a few islands down here, went up to Thailand up north. And when I was in Thailand, I ran into some seasoned travelers, and they said, "Are you going to go to Burma?" And I said, "What's Burma?" I don't know much about it. Well, it's right next door, and they've just opened up a country that was closed for decades, kind of on the model of North Korea these days, where there's just not much coming in or going out. And a lot of things hadn't changed there very much. They just opened up for tourism not too long before that. This was 1985 when I went, 30 years ago now. And went to Burma on a 7-day visa. And I understand Larry went there 2 years earlier than me on a 7-day visa for the first time. And what I saw was amazing. It was a country that really was a culture that you cannot describe, a history that is very vibrant, a society that used to be a very advanced society maybe 1,000 years ago. There were universities there. But a country that has faced a lot of turmoil, and especially in recent years, a militarily ruled country with an economy that was just going nowhere for most of the people. I spent 7 days there. I learned a bit about black markets in Burma, and as an economist, I learned how to do things in the black market, like travel to places where the military didn't want me to go. I also found that the military doesn't like that and have stories of being chased by troops and wondering if I was going to make it out. And I did, with lots of stories, lots of memories. But it was really about the Burmese people for me. The people are an amazing, wonderful, friendly people, but they were also going through crisis. And I had people come up to me and say, you've got to tell your government to do something about this. It's awful here. Life is awful. We have slavery. We have a repressive government. We have no human rights. We need your government to do something. And I would say, why are you talking to me? I'm just one person. I don't have control over my government and their policies with yours. And I heard this a lot. They said, you have a lot more power than we do. You Americans have that. Please tell your government. Please tell your people what's going on in Burma. And so when I came back, I was inspired to find out more, and I ran into Larry and his organization at the time, the Free Burma Coalition. It was doing great international work, but they were right here. And got an opportunity to bring Larry to campus a number of times, and as we said before, have learned so much about it. And this is one way I hope to be able to give back to the Burmese people and spread the word, and I think Larry's doing a heck of a lot more on that than I am. He has an amazing background on this. A little bit about Burma. You might have known that in November this year, their National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, who's, by the way, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, won a stunning nationwide election. They defeated this military establishment that's ruled Burma, also known as Myanmar, since 1962. Ms. Suu Kyi, the daughter of a leader of the coup, has been under house arrest from 1989 to 2010. Under the new government, the military will continue to hold many levels of power. It's not a complete change. Undoubtedly, a complex dance between entrenched interest and the will of the people is unfolding in front of our eyes right now. A brief profile for Myanmar, also what I call Burma, is available at the table where you signed in tonight. Please help yourself. I think there's a lot of interesting information on the country. Our speaker tonight, Larry Doors, few are as qualified as tonight's speaker to lead a discussion on Burma. Larry's a founding board member of the U.S. Campaign for Burma. That's a leading U.S. advocacy organization working for justice and democracy in Burma or Myanmar. He's been active on behalf of democracy and justice in Burma for more than 20 years. He's traveled there many times, including several times last year. I found out he was on the blacklist for travel for a while. Maybe we'll find out more about that. Maybe made a few secret trips across the border. We don't know for sure, just a rumor. Since 2013, he's been the executive advisor to the executive and board of directors of All You Need Is Love charity, which provides educational services to migrant and refugee communities along the Thai-Burma border. He's an economist, as I said, and holds an MA in Southeast Asian Studies from the University of Michigan. He's a visiting scholar now in Southeast Asian Studies at Texas Christian University, or TCU, and he's published widely on Southeast Asian affairs. The format is that Larry will speak, we will take questions. You can ask directly, or you can write your questions on a card that was provided in your program. So now, can you please join me in welcoming Larry Doors?
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Larry, for having me here, and thank you, Shoreline. I always enjoy coming up here, and I appreciate that Shoreline is such an internationally focused place with the student body and with the curriculum to really think about Shoreline and the Seattle area and its place in the world. So, I'm grateful that you're here in my neighborhood, and always happy to come up and talk, and I'm sure this won't be the last time. Just, very, very briefly about Burma or Myanmar. Let's start with the name, right? So for a while, it was very much a political thing because in 1988, there had been the big uprising that was violently suppressed in the country of Burma. And not long after, the military, who had suppressed the people and killed thousands of them in the streets, decided to rename the country and said that it's now called Myanmar. And there are actually some historical reasons to support that. But for political reasons, those who were against the military dictatorship always tended to want to call it Burma. And so it was even the name of the country was, you were already entering into a political conversation. Nowadays, it's a little bit less so. I kind of half-jokingly say, as long as we're talking about it, I don't care whether you call it Burma or Myanmar. And when you travel there, inside the country, people tend to call it Myanmar, but many of my friends who live along the Thai-Burma border and who are from some of the ethnic minority communities feel very strongly, and they won't call it Myanmar, and they continue to call it Burma. So you'll hear me jump back and forth, and I don't mind. You can call it either one, just as long as we're talking about it. But I think it's worth noting that an important distinction is between the ethnic Burmans, who are the dominant ethnic group in the country, and then calling somebody a Burmese. And it's a little bit similar to the country of Laos, where there are people who are ethnically Lao, but the people, for instance, the Hmong people, many of whom live here in our community, and they're visible when you go to the Pike Place Market and buy from the flower vendors, those are Hmong people. They are Laotian, because they come from the country of Laos, but they're not Lao because that's an ethnic group. So in Burma, the Burmans are an ethnic group, but you can use the word Burmese to describe anybody who comes from the country. So when we are going to talk about the ethnic issue, because it is a multi-ethnic state, and that's a real key issue that we're going to go forward with. So it does have a glorious history that goes back 1,200, 1,300 years. It was colonized by the British and became part of British India. There was an independence movement that was given a great boost by the Japanese invasion in World War II. It's very important to realize that World War II was fought all the way across Burma, where the Japanese pushed the British out, and it's some very famous stories of people escaping to India. It was it's a very rough country, so it was tough. And then the Allies fought all the way back through and pushed the Japanese out. World War II was fought all the way across the country, both directions. Means destroy every bridge, damage every road, anything that the enemy can use as an asset, destroy, right? So twice the country was destroyed. Then Aung San, who was the leader of the first independent Burmese army, who had gotten his training along with the so-called 30 comrades on Hainan Island there in China from the Japanese, he was the uniter. He was seen by all the ethnic groups and by all parties as the leader. And he went, and he was 30 years old, and he went to London and he negotiated independence for his country. And he did that successfully. But before they got independence, he was having a cabinet meeting in Rangoon, and gunmen burst in, a political rival funded these gunmen, and they assassinated him and a number of other people. These two things, the fact that World War II had been fought all the way across the country twice, and that the national leader on the eve of independence was murdered. These are two things that put the country at tremendous disadvantage, and in certain sense, they're still kind of struggling with that. So you had, after that, 1948 to 1962 was an independent democratic period. It was a stumbling democracy. It was not a thriving democracy. There was a lot of civil war going on and lots of factionalism and so forth. And then in 1962 was a military coup. And from basically 1962 until the day before yesterday, the military has ruled this country. So that's a very, very long period of time. And that has its implications as well, because people have been, when you live under this severely repressive military mindset, it changes the way you operate and it changes the way you think. And so change is likely to come a little bit slowly. But they had elections last November 8th, and those elections were held in a pretty reasonable manner. There wasn't violence. I was very concerned about an October surprise and that sort of thing, and it didn't really happen. The elections were relatively free within a somewhat unfair environment, and the party of Aung San Suu Kyi, who's the daughter of that great independence hero, she was 2 years old when he was assassinated, her party won a huge victory. So that's just to sort of set the scene. So what I want to do, if it's okay, I'll kind of talk about the good news and the bad news. And then I'll sum up a little bit, and then I would love to take questions and discuss about it. Because there's actually lots of good news and lots of bad news. So, as I mentioned, the elections went off pretty well. That said, there's at least one ethnic community that was totally disenfranchised, who used to have citizenship and the right to participate in the political process, and had it stripped in the last couple of years. And that's a group called the Rohingya, who live out near the Bangladesh border. So it's okay. I think we're all right for the moment. And as the elections were being held, there were two hot wars being fought. One in Shan State, which is out near the Thai and Lao border, and one in Kachin State, which is at the very north of the country. Helicopter gunships, jet fighter attacks, the day of the election. So yes, the election was a success, but you have to think about the context, and there's a lot of reasons why the powers that be don't really want to talk about the problems and want to focus on the good. And there's, things are so much better, so much better. You know, when I was there in 1996, which was the last time I visited before I got on the blacklist, I was very active already, and I was able to arrange a meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi. And afterwards, I went to the big marketplace that's actually called the Aung San Market, named after her father. And I kind of walked around and I said, I want to buy pictures of Aung San Suu Kyi. Can I buy pictures of Aung San Suu Kyi? Oh, the fear was tremendous, tremendous. And so I learned pretty quickly, I won't ask anymore. The mechanism that they would use, and there were people following, and then they would talk with people like, what did you talk to him about, right? And if they didn't like the answers, you could be arrested. If you got involved in that system, then they would say, your sister, who goes to Rangoon University, she's kicked out. Your uncle, his apartment, he lost his lease, right? Your dad, his business, no more business license. All this sort of communal responsibility. So if somebody stepped out of line, they'd make the whole family pay. So it was very, like fear was, you could smell it, taste it, feel it everywhere you went. That's not true anymore. It's not true. That's profoundly different. It's enormously different. Part of the good news, right? The National League for Democracy, that's the party that Aung San Suu Kyi co-founded, won almost 80% of the seats. And it's interesting because they held elections in 1990. The world was very upset at these massacres in 1988. And the National League for Democracy, founded by Aung San Suu Kyi, won 82% of the seats in the May 1990 elections. So between 1990 and 2015, 25 years later, the same party with the same leader won just about the same victory. Only in 1990, they were not allowed to take their seats in Parliament, and day before yesterday, they took their seats in Parliament. So it's, again, different. The military didn't allow it to happen. They simply ignored the vote last time. This time, they didn't. So it's exciting. It's exciting. There's a lot of optimism. And so the fact that the population is united behind this one party wins 4 out of 5 seats. The military-backed party won 10% of the seats. So, the fact that everybody got the opportunity again to express themselves politically was a big victory. Also, it was good because you may have heard that there was an anti-Muslim movement led by Buddhist monks. It's a big country, 400,000 to 500,000 Buddhist monks. Among the community of Buddhist monks, my Burmese friend points out, you'll have some of the best people in the country and some of the worst people in the country who become Buddhist monks. And some of these monks have preached violence against, in particular, that Rohingya ethnic minority, but it spread to the Muslim community in various cities, against the Muslim community in various cities, and with a lot of violent rhetoric and words that a monk, for those of us who've been around monks for a while, would never expect to hear. So there was fear that they would be very powerful in the election. And they were trying to set up, and they're backed by reactionary forces and military forces. And those people were trying to set up the election basically to say, are you for Buddhism or are you for Islam, right? And the Burmese, if they adopted that thinking, more than 90% of the Burmese are Buddhist. So naturally, they would say, well, I'm for Buddhism. Who do I vote for? But they saw through it. That was a real good thing in terms of the election, that thinking didn't dominate. And there was a lot of worry because sort of when it went bad, when it's gone bad, it's been very, very violent. Murders of school children you can see on YouTube. So serious. Had almost no effect on the election. That was fabulous. There's now a ton of goodwill, right? A country that's been under military dictatorship for 50 years is now voting freely. People want to help. That's a story that people want to help, right? And for the Obama administration, this is a fairly important foreign policy success. And it's been a very tough environment for them, and they don't have a lot of foreign policy successes to point to. And so to be able to say, look at Burma, nobody fired a shot. And it has transitioned from military to dictatorship to democracy. So the United States is ready, and Canada and the EU, Japan, Korea, all excited to step in. And let's be honest, the motivation behind the US is to challenge Chinese dominance in Burma. Because during the time that Burma was a pariah state, China, Thailand, Singapore, regional countries dealt with them just fine. And China became absolutely the dominant economic force in the country. And the United States saw that as being against US interests. And the United States, which by golly, I went to Washington, D.C. and year after year, and we used to be told all the time, CIA says the United States has no significant interests in Burma. So basically, you're not going to get the United States to take any big steps. But it took a while, but finally people realized, well, in fact, it is the bridge country between the largest population in the world and the second largest population in the world. It's strategically very important. I hate to say it, but kind of like, well, yeah, we were telling you this all along. But anyway, the United States did start to come around and take some interest. So the United States is very keen to help, and not necessarily in a selfless manner, right? Foreign policy is about your own national interest. And so Burma has become a front line of the competition for influence between China and everybody else. And when you're clever, if you're clever, and you're in that sort of environment, you can play one side against the other. Well, the Chinese have offered me this. Or you say to the Chinese, well, the United States will give us this if we act in this manner. What do you got for us, right? So it creates big opportunity for Burma to move forward finally. So, in a certain sense, that's good. A lot of foreign direct investment has been sitting on the sidelines. I've talked to a lot of businessmen. And they were waiting to see, how are these elections going to play out? And again, still waiting in a certain sense, because Monday they sat in Parliament, they got their ID badges, right? It's like the first day of class, you don't necessarily do all that much. But so far the process has gone pretty well. Between the November 8th elections and February 1st Parliament sits. And now we have another 2 months to the end of March before we'll decide who's the president, and the president then will choose his or her cabinet, and the government will sit. So we have another 2 months. So in a certain sense, everybody is still kind of waiting to make sure that everything is going to go smoothly, but confidence is growing all the way along. So there's a lot of investment. It's a very, very poor country. Labor rates are, it's a place for cheap labor, right? So it's a beautiful country, incredible. The size of Texas, the size of France, population 50 to 53 million. So, it has a lot of potential, good tourism potential for investors. Neighboring Thailand has 20 million visitors a year, and Burma is really around 1 million. So the opportunity for them to grow their tourism industry is huge. Light manufacturing, garment manufacturing, shoe manufacturing, that sort of thing, good opportunities, though the infrastructure is poor, and so therefore you're going to pay more money to move things around, given those realities. But there's a lot of stuff on the sidelines, and now it's starting to happen. I met a guy from Microsoft, and Microsoft has what are called Microsoft Innovation Centers. And they've set up, I think, 30 of them around the world, and they are going to set one up in Yangon. And that's an exciting opportunity, right? That's the kind of thing that we need. And they're going to be there in March, and hopefully I'll be there myself, and we can see how they're going to do this investment. But Microsoft involved, lots of Western companies involved, very positive. Then this is the part that I really am excited about, and I think that anybody in the social sciences should look at this and say, wow, this is a case that we should study. Just 5 years ago, the telephone penetration in the country, second lowest in Asia, only North Korea was worse, right? My friend Puent, who grew up in Burma, talks about she still remembers the first time her family made a phone call, because they didn't have a phone. They got all dressed up because her dad was in Malaysia and they were going to go phone her dad. They got dressed up and went to the postal center so that they could make a phone call, and you'd put the call in and then you'd sit and wait sometimes for hours, and then the phone call would get connected and you could talk. They had extremely low telephone penetration. And then, and the other part of it is the cell phones, a SIM card for a cell phone costs thousands of dollars. So basically only government bigwigs or real rich people who were cronies of the military government would have access to these. Again, my friend Puent, her aunt, because she worked in the government, got a SIM card, and she traded the SIM card for an apartment. So this was in the early 2000s, right? But part of the reform that really started in 2011 included opening this up. And in 2014, they allowed 2 foreign companies to begin to sell SIM cards and so forth. So cell phone penetration was just a fraction of a percent 5 years ago. Now it's up to 50%. And 80% of those cell phones are smartphones. And by the end of this year, 60% of the people, through their cell phones, 60% of the population of the country is going to have access to the internet. You go back just a couple of years, and it was almost nobody. It was low single-digit percent. So you're seeing a transformation of a place where for 50 years communication was very difficult. Your family would get dressed up to go to the postal center to make a phone call. And now everybody has phones, and yes, everybody walks around like this, it's the same as here. But that's a good thing, because it's opportunity. And one of the things that they've done is they built into the telecoms law that the cell phone operators have to offer mobile banking services. And this is really, really interesting. I heard an interview with Melinda Gates yesterday, the day before, on public radio. something that the Gates Foundation is very, very interested in. And in Burma, Myanmar, people have not had access to banks. So not only they didn't have a phone, they didn't have a bank. And now, in one little device that they can carry in their pockets, they have communication and they have the opportunity, it's only developing now, for banking services as well. That's incredible. To my knowledge, there's nowhere in the world where it's gone, this transformation has taken place so swiftly. And it's got to be something exciting to study. Creates lots of opportunity. So it's really, that's a real big deal. And this is one of those, putting the toothpaste back in the tube, putting the genie back in the bottle is going to be difficult. If things go backwards, it's going to be difficult to take everybody's cell phone away, right? It is pretty difficult to take your cell phone away, right? People don't like that. Also, strong growth in civil society organization, right? Again, there was a long period of time where the military looked at any kind of organizing as a threat. And so even if you were organizing for a social purpose, they considered you to be dangerous and watched you very closely. There's a well-known actor from Burma whose son actually lives here and works in the tech industry here in Seattle, very nice guy. His mom and dad are heroes. And they started the Free Funeral Society, this was in the early 2000s, because they were interested in developing, social networks and so forth. And so they needed to find out, like, how can we start? How can we get started in here? And so they said, well, we're going to offer free funerals for indigent people. What could be less threatening than that, right? Somebody who died, didn't have the money for the funeral, we're going to do it. So they created a charity and started to do it. And he did get arrested, right? But he didn't get put in jail very long. Some people got very, very long jail sentences. He really didn't. He was a very, very well-known person. Anybody who was there in the 90s knows he was like the star of every movie that they had. So from that, then they would always push out just a little bit. Well, the free funerals are going pretty well. Let's do this, let's do this, let's do this. And in a certain sense, I think you can credit him as a pioneer for civil society movements in Burma. He's just done amazing things, and now it's become widespread. And again, people are working together for social purpose, not asking permission, just doing it. And I'm hopeful that that's one of these ratchet up and never go back down again, because they are coming out of a period where, again, under dictatorship, you basically do what you're told, for good or ill, but you don't do anything until you're told, and then you do exactly what you're told and nothing more. So it's very exciting to see that there's this kind of transition. The strategic location is, as I mentioned before, becoming recognized. And my wife and I, and then later my son and I, last year, took Asia Highway 1, the Pan-Asian Highway, that's meant to connect all the countries of the region, from Vietnam to India. And once you crossed from Thailand, where the infrastructure is excellent, then you came to the road inside Burma, and it was one way one day and one way the other. It was a one-lane road through the mountain range. And literally, you saw teenage kids who really didn't want to be there, breaking rocks and tossing rocks in potholes on this Asia Highway 1. So it was like, no, this is not good infrastructure, right? This is not a good way to do it. But since then, and by golly, I'm leaving in a week, and I'm going to go on the new highway, because the old highway was very uncomfortable. I'm going to go on the new highway that goes around, and it's 4 lanes and fast and so forth, and the amount of transport and intercourse between Thailand and Burma now is 10 times what it was 2 years ago, and it's growing so fast you can't even keep up with it. So all these things, these are very positive. You know, the more interaction, they were isolated for a long time, and now just the opportunities that exist from people coming together. And then the one other thing is they, in the same way in China, in the early 80s, they started to free up farmers to make their own decisions. Make your own planting decisions. And of course, that's the right idea because the farmers are the ones who know their land, and they know that sorghum will grow here, and barley will grow there, and rice will grow here, and corn, and so forth. They know that stuff. But it's been a command economy where they've been told what to grow and when and so forth, and they have been required to sell a certain amount of a specific commodity, rice, corn, whatever, to the government at these very low prices. So they had to grow it because they were going to have to sell it to the government. It looks very, very likely that they're going to remove those requirements. And as you saw in China in the early days of economic reform, it's like a spring that's wound up. It's potential energy. And when you take the constraints off, things can grow. And I hope, because 70% of the population is still working in agriculture in Burma. It's a very rural country. So I hope that they follow through on this. And if we can see the farmers becoming prosperous, then the country will become prosperous. If the development stays focused in Yangon, Rangoon, and the other big cities, then the country will not necessarily succeed. That's the good news. So here's the bad news. The bad news is that the military didn't design this system to give up power, right? They wrote a constitution that was passed in 2008. I don't know if any of you remember there was a cyclone in 2008 called Cyclone Nargis. And at that time, according to the government, I think they acknowledged that about 150,000 people were killed in that cyclone. And I'm pretty sure that that's undercounting it by 100,000 people, easy. And a week later, they ratified this constitution. They did not stop the vote. They said, do it anyway. And lo and behold, you know, whatever the figure was, 93.6% of the people supported the Constitution, and it became the Constitution of the land. This Constitution, you know, that was a complete bogus vote. The elections in 2015, 7 years later, was not a bogus vote, but this one was. So this Constitution says that the Commander-in-Chief of the military names the Home Minister, which is the Interior Ministry, which oversees the entire justice system, and the Defense Minister and the Minister of Border Affairs. And it says that the military budget is not under the control of the civilian government, and it says basically that the military itself is not under control of the military government. So you have this very experienced military that's had 50 years in power that still has autonomy. It is not controlled by the government that just got elected on November 8th and just sat in Parliament day before yesterday. It's not controlled by them. So basically, the election that we just saw is for a box, right? Who gets to control part of the government? And everything that that government wants to do, they're going to have to negotiate with the powers that be, that are the military. Right? So the job is not done. It's very, very far from that. But this is a little complicated. Again, I was in Washington, D.C. in last March, and we had lots of meetings, National Security Council and State Department and so forth. And every time you'd start to say, yeah, but the Constitution, the 2008 Constitution, right? Nobody wanted to hear about the 2008 Constitution, blah, 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 blah. Let's get into a discussion about the Burmese Constitution. But the reality is, it was a serious problem, and it still is. So everything is going to have to be negotiated. Everything that the NLD wants to do is going to have to be negotiated. The other problem is 35 to 40% of the population are not Burman. They're ethnic minority groups, and they tend to live in the mountains that surround the central plain, and that's where that second map, if you could pop that up. And so the minorities live in the periphery, and the Burmans live in the center, right? Yep, that's the one. So it's pretty straightforward. You can see these are mountains, and the ethnic communities live around the edges. And the army has always treated this as a military issue. It's a political issue. When you have 35 or 40% of the people in different ethnic groups, you got to negotiate, you got to deal with political power. But it's been dealt with as a military issue, and they've applied military force in order to control those border areas rather than negotiate. To negotiate is to capitulate in the military thinking. So they simply haven't done it. So what's going to happen there? Just because Aung San Suu Kyi is, her party is in power, does that mean that all these problems will be solved? No, unfortunately not. And I'm afraid, and a lot of people are afraid, that in this endless series of negotiating, every single thing is going to have to be negotiated. The army is going to say, yeah, but the one thing that we're not going to talk about is control of the ethnic areas. And the NLD could say, yeah, but we want peace and so forth. Well, but we also want all sorts of things in terms of an investment law and to be able to do this and this and this and this and this. And I'm worried that they'll simply give it away and that the army will continue to treat the ethnic minorities as the enemy, as they have for decades. And if that's the case, then it makes it practically impossible to go forward. Other issue is capacity, government capacity. The government spending per capita in Burma is $40 per year, $40. So Indonesia, which is not a rich country, is right about in the middle in the region in terms of its per capita income and so forth. Indonesia spends $600 per person per year. So you can see that 93% less is what the Burmese have on hand to spend. So they need to up their taxing, right, in order to get more revenue, and they need to develop out their capacity to be able to deliver services. But with $40 per person per year, you're not going to get much service out of your government, right? So that's just a huge, huge issue. It's going to go on and on and on. And the NLD has been in opposition their entire lives. They haven't actually run anything except a political party. So that's a challenge. Lots of people, foreign experts, want to go in and help, but there's a lot of cynicism about foreign experts who go in and stay at $250 a night hotels and make $100,000 a year, and all the money that's dedicated to foreign aid disappears in the process. So, yeah, there's a lot of desire to help, but is it going to make a difference? So, there are still problems with lack of rule of law, unequal application of law, not surprising. The military still controls large amounts of the economy. That's not going away. That's going to be very difficult to pry their fingers off of control of logging, jade mining, the natural gas, big money stuff. So it's, these are going to be a big challenge. And I think the final big danger is sky-high expectations, right? Auntie Suu, Aung San Suu Kyi, in Burmese, Da Suu. Auntie Suu can solve our problems. If we vote for Auntie Suu, our problems will go away. There's a lot of belief there. It's a fairly naive belief, but it's understandable At least she's stood up all these years to the military. She may have spent 20 years under house arrest. She sacrificed, she made the effort, and she's been successful. All our problems are taken care of. It's not true. It's going to be very difficult. You know, these sorts of things take a long time. So when you disappoint sky-high expectations, goodness sakes, you know, there's a danger of a reaction of anger, disappointment, frustration. How is that going to play out? So that's where we are today. It's a whole lot better, but the problems are nowhere near solved. And the narrative has tended to get way out ahead of the reality on the ground in Burma. And so it's a point of uncertainty in a long path, but hopefully headed in the right direction. So I'd love to have any questions that somebody might have.
Okay, ask your question. Use the microphone if you would, because we are recording it.
What was the name that you gave again?
Name of?
The savior?
Auntie Suu, Aung San Suu Kyi. Right, so they call her Da Suu.
I have two questions.
Sure.
Thanks for the very interesting lectures. Question number one is, are they able to do something on that Rohingya issue? Why were they stripped of their nationality or whatever, their rights? The second question is it safe to visit them now as an ordinary tourist?
So just to be clear about the second part of your question, is it safe to visit Myanmar? I would say absolutely. You know, it's in fact a great place to visit. The only problem is their tourism infrastructure is behind in terms of being able to take care of people. Sometimes it's hard to get a hotel room because there are so many tourists there compared to the number of rooms that there are right now. But safety, it's a great place. And also even, I would say for women who want to travel alone, not every country in the world is particularly safe. And I would say Myanmar is a relatively safe place to go. The Rohingya issue is very complicated. The first thing that you find in knowing Burmese people is there is a really, really strong bias against this ethnic group. And the only thing that I can compare it to is to the Roma or the Gypsies in Europe, where in a lot of countries, Romania and Serbia and so forth, they're considered very badly. And sometimes that's a self-feeding cycle. Well, you're outside society and so there's no use for me to try to fit in because they're not gonna let me fit in, so I'm gonna live outside the society and you get into this divide. So there's a real strong bias against the Rohingya. And then it was played up for political purposes in the lead up to this election that helped pull it apart. And many people were disappointed that Aung San Suu Kyi herself, seen as a human rights icon, didn't stand up for the Rohingya. But she would say, I'm a politician now and I'm trying to win an election. And by standing up for the Rohingya, I can guarantee you I will gain 0 votes and I will lose millions of votes. So I'm not gonna do it, and I'm sure that she rationalized it by saying the best thing for the Rohingya is for me to win the election because I'm a more open-minded and thoughtful person about these things than most people are. And she's probably correct there. But it still is, it's dynamite, it's playing with fire in the Burmese political context. And I think that it's gonna be some time before anything gets better for that community. At least perhaps it won't continue to get worse. But it's really, really serious. Last May, when there were shiploads of these people who had no food, no water, no fuel, no nothing, and no country in the region would allow them to land. And it was only fishermen in Indonesia who said, I can't do this. And they brought them in and they fed them. And then Indonesia said, okay, we'll let them stay, but somebody has to offer a third country haven. So that's a really, really tough one. And it can be vexing to deal with human rights activists from Burma who don't recognize the human rights of that community. had a couple.
Thank you. So as you mentioned before, I have two questions. So first of all, the leader of the Myanmar or Burma, Aung San Suu Kyi, was saying that before the general election, was saying that after the election, she will be beyond the presidency. And in my personal opinion, I really respect what she did in the past. But will you see that that can be in the path of her dictatorship or a new style of dictatorship in Burma, and what you think about the future of her leadership? And the second question you mentioned before as well, many companies, majority of the companies in Burma is still owned by the military. What can the international society can do to make sure that the benefit of the economic growth in the country can share to the people? Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you very much. I appreciate them both. In a military dictatorship, what happens is things become very, very centralized, and decision-making has become extremely centralized. Again, we had 50 years of this, right? So the control of the economy is extremely centralized. And so what all of us, and I think this is true for American universities who want to go and work over there, is to resist the centralization. Resist everything having to go straight to the minister's office. Try to do things at the local level, at the smaller level. And of course, Monsanto wants to go in and do business there and do agribusiness, and they're going to continue to support the centralized approach. They're going to go straight to the Minister of Agriculture and want to sign a big deal and on and on and on. And that is not going to get them out of this problem that they have with gross over-centralization of authority, of decision-making, and so forth. So I think having in mind that the long-term well-being of Burma and of any investment that we make is served by trying to fight this centralization is probably the best thing that we could ask foreigners to have in mind when they go there. Try to do it at a smaller scale, at a more localized scale, and not feed it into this centralized system. So Aung San Suu Kyi, by the 2008 Constitution, is not allowed to be president. And that's because, coincidentally, the 2008 Constitution says that anyone who was married to a foreigner or who has children who carry foreign passports cannot be president. Well, it just so happens that she was married to a British academic and she has 2 sons who carry British passports, coincidentally. So she, by the Constitution, is not allowed to be president, even though her party won almost 80% of the seats in the election. So she came out with a quote that said, well, essentially I'll be above the president, and the president will be someone who essentially does my bidding. And that didn't really sit too well with the military and with a lot of people. There's a lot of concern that maybe all we're doing is trading one dictatorship for another. And I think there may be a lot of validity in that. The political culture is not, they're not used to having lots of devolved, spread out political power. And so a benevolent dictator is better than, a malevolent dictator. And so, maybe people would accept that. So that's a possibility, but it's not until the end of March that we'll know who the president is. So we have this period now where it's horse trading, discussion, negotiation, and so forth. She is still trying to work out to amend the Constitution, get rid of that rule that says she can't be president, that would allow her then to go ahead and fill that role. But in order to amend the Constitution, you need to have 75% of the vote of Parliament to support it. But the 2008 Constitution reserves 25% of the seats in Parliament to active serving military officers, people who are under the command of the head of the army, right? So it's their duty to vote as the commander-in-chief says. So you can't change the Constitution without the cooperation of the military. So they're having these discussions right now. But you can understand, none of these military guys can step out of line. They are under orders. If you voted against the way your commanding officer told you to vote, you have just violated your responsibility as a military officer. So it's very, very difficult. So much goes back to this 2008 Constitution. As little as we want to talk about some obscure Constitution, it's the rules under which all this is happening. So how she's going to finesse this, but I think that honestly, it may be most efficient for her to start out as a benevolent dictator, and then hopefully, over time, she devolves power. But what do they say about absolute power and corrupting? We'll see.
Thank you. I have two questions as well. The first one, I'm wondering about your opinions on U.S. sanctions. Specifically, I'm thinking about how many of the sanctions that we have in place will be impacting this new democratically elected government, and what you think the role of those sanctions will play in their ability to engage with outside markets. Second, I was wondering what you foresee happening in the first 100 days of said benevolent dictatorship.
Man. Well, the second question is very, very difficult, because it's so easy to say, oh, well, ethnic relations is a priority issue. But so is the infrastructure. It's a priority issue. So is providing agricultural extension services and agricultural credit to the majority of the people who are farming. That's really important. Need to reform the education system. These are all critical issues. So how they're going to juggle all these things and actually get moving, I don't know. I'm going to be watching very closely. It's a really it's a tough question. Now on U.S. sanctions, most of the U.S. sanctions were suspended when the reform started in 2011, and they were suspended in 2012. There are still some restrictions through the Treasury Department of doing business with particular people, and these are people who are either serving military, ex-military, or what they call cronies. In the lingo there, that's the word they use as well, is the cronies. And yes, that does make it somewhat difficult for big companies to go in because the people with the most business experience are either military, ex-military, or cronies. I was on a panel with Coca-Cola, the guy who set up Coca-Cola's thing there, and he went through all the due diligence that they had gone through in order to identify a business partner who had business acumen, but wasn't on that list. And I think and Burmese names are kind of funny because you don't carry a family name and so forth. And I think he said that there were 5 different Zawzaws that he had to go, and that's a Zaw. So that there were 5 different Zawzaws where they had to go and figure out and say, well, no, that's this Zaza, not that Zaza. And anyway, they ended up with a pretty good partner. But it took a tremendous amount of effort. And I respect that. And Coca-Cola has really done things quite well as they've gone into Burma. But I think overall, reasonableness is prevailing. And the U.S. is trying to make it possible for good people to do good business. And if they have to suspend a sanction here or let somebody off the list there, the U.S. has shown willingness to do it. So I don't think that the U.S. sanctions are going to be an impediment going forward the way they were in the past. That's my opinion.
So I'm wondering about what the first issue between the military and the new parliament could work out on, and where do you think they're going to have the most trouble working the new deal out in terms of their negotiations?
Yeah, I think the first one is this: who's the president, and whether constitutional change can take place. This is a good example of an illustration of the difficulty of constitutional change. Look, you know, NLD won 80% of the seats, 78% of the seats, and yet their leader can't be president, you know? So this is probably a good place to push on that. So I think that initially that's probably it. The two next, the most difficult ones are going to be military-controlled corporations, which really do, like Global Witness published a report late last year talking about the jade industry. Most of the world's jade comes from Burma. The big market for Burmese jade is in China. And so Global Witness suggested in 2014, the year that they looked at, $30 billion was the value of the jade. It wasn't taxed, so tax money from that didn't go into the national coffers. And it was run across the border, for the most part, into China. And that's entirely controlled by military companies and military cronies. That's a lot of money, right? So how are you going to convince them to give that up? And that's just an example. Again, oil and gas, timber, gold. It's a resource-rich country. Plenty of resources, but these are very economically powerful people, and they don't want to give it up, you know? So that's gonna happen slowly. So that's the second big one, and then I think the third one is the ethnic relations, border issues, and how that's gonna be dealt with. You know, they are still fighting. There are 100,000 people displaced in Kachin State. There are tens of thousands of people displaced in Shan State from the fighting going on right now. How are we gonna move beyond that? And this is, you know, in terms of the military thinking, this is their bailiwick. This is national security. Don't try and rip it away from me. So I would say that the constitutional change and then those two are going to be the tough ones. And that's three really, really tough ones. It's going to be difficult.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier United States influence during the elections and their opposition to the military. You also mentioned the Rohingya and how they were mistreated by the military. China, also a province not so favorable toward the Muslim community, also has the same basically attitude. So in that, trying to put two and two together, is the military influenced by China, and United States is also influencing the NLD, obviously for its own benefits, to maintain a balance of power in Burma?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question because so much of this is, you know, like it or not, big power politics plays out in small countries, and not always to the benefit of the people who are caught in the middle. The Chinese have been the major patron of the Burmese military. So during the dictatorship years, you know, China protected them at the UN Security Council. You couldn't get anything done on Burma and so forth. They were the protectors and they were the big investors. They didn't really invest in a way that created sort of mutual benefit for the Burmese people along with the investors. And so there was built up a lot of resentment among the population. It doesn't take you very long walking around Burma to hear people express resentment against the Chinese. So the military kind of pulled back, and how Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD, the new government, is going to develop its relations with China, how it's going to balance between the United States and China, I guess that's the next part of the answer to your question is, you know, it's a challenge, and we don't know how that's going to play out. So it's not really black and white. China is behind the military, United States behind the democracy movement, and now fight it out. The U.S. is trying to develop relations with the military. Aung San Suu Kyi has gone to Beijing and was treated very well. So, you know, there's a lot of gray area in it. But, you know, I think your point is legitimate. You know, China with the Xinjiang province and the Uyghur population, it's very contentious. Thailand in the far south with Malay Muslims, there is a lot of violence, thousands of people killed down there. You know, Burma, again, a problem. And in Burma, you know, the one thing is, you see Bangladesh, not a really big country. It's actually about the size of Louisiana. And the population is about 155 million, right? So imagine half the United States population packed into the state of Louisiana all by itself. So it's a very large, almost entirely Muslim population. And so from an existential point of view, it's not that hard in Burma to say, holy cow, there's 3 times the population, they're all Muslims, and they're gonna come and get us. And so, you know, people who want to play to that fear find fertile ground. So, again, that's one that's just gonna take some time to develop. But how the three, the sort of dealing with Islam, dealing with China, dealing with the United States, it's all a swirl right now. We've only had 2 days so far.
So I don't see a lot of Burmese students in the U.S. I'm wondering if you think that might open up a little bit in the coming years, and is there interest in young people in coming to study, whether it's business or IT or politics, things that might help their country continue to advance?
Yeah, I would say yes. You know, it is certainly, you know, in the past it was very, very difficult even for them to get a passport. You'd have to pay lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of money to be able to get a passport. And so it was very restrictive in terms of students being able to come and study abroad. There have been programs, and, you know, University of Washington will have a couple of Burmese students and so forth, but that, you know, obviously that's at a very large university, and compared to Chinese or Indonesian or Korean or Japanese students, you know, this is just a tiny, tiny amount. Yes, there's tremendous interest, you know, tremendous interest. And I always feel like when there's sort of the pent-up demand, like there are some people who are so bright and so capable who just haven't had an opportunity. Like if we could reach out to those people right now as things are changing, we are talking about some amazing students. But per capita income in the country is only a little above $1,000 per person per year. Here in the US, it's around $56,000 per person per year. So it's, you know, this is very poor, and they just don't have the money. USAID is doing some support, and State Department is doing some support, but, you know, we're really talking about at a mass scale to really make a difference. That said, there are some smaller programs. A guy here locally has developed one, and I think he has about 60 Burmese students studying at Thai universities now, which are, you know, it's much less expensive to be able to simply, you know, you can go there by land, and living in Thailand is, of course, much cheaper than it is here. So, you know, there is some effort there. But the opportunity, it seems to me, is much larger, and so far it's going to waste a little bit. You know, it's too bad. I was lucky to travel in China in the early '80s, and there was the post-Cultural Revolution generation who knew that they had missed out on educational opportunities. Their time was done. It was too late. Now they're 28, 30 years old. They're never going to go. And they were mad, they were frustrated, you know, and I hope that we don't lose any more people than we have to in Burma in that way.
Thank you. Given limited funding, what would you say should be the #1 priority of USAID in Burma?
I think that, you know, what I would really want to focus on is rural development. You know, when you have 70% of the labor force in agriculture, focus there. And especially over time, you know, essentially the military government advantage the urban population, keep food prices low. That way there's, you know, there's not going to be demonstrations and riots and so forth in the cities. And that means, you know, underpaying the farmers. And when the bulkier people are farmers, you know, that's the way to build toward a prosperous country. And AID there are other examples. Land reform and in Korea and Taiwan helped launch the economic successes in those places. They're doing some interesting work in Africa, again, with around land issues. So that's what I think they should do. It's just so much easier to do something centralized and let's do a big project and I can stay in my air-conditioned office and not go out there. And that's a problem with any kind of aid structure. But it has to be decentralized. It has to reach out, agricultural credit opportunity to increase the productivity of their farms and stuff. That's what they should be doing.
Thank you. I want to know, from economist point of view, what do you think the future economy is going to be like? Is it still going to be command economy, or are they going to switch to a market economy? And if so, you mentioned that her husband had a British passport, and you said it was a coincidence, but is it really a coincidence?
No, yeah.
Being colonized by Britain? So I just wanted to know their influence as well as on the economy, and if they're going to follow a certain country.
Yeah, so the coincidence was not that she married a British academic, it was that the Constitution said if you just so happen to have married a British academic, then you can't be president. Obviously, it seems to me that the former colonial power has particular responsibilities. But Britain is not the power that it used to be and is a long way away. And yes, there is, just in general, you go to Britain, more people are knowledgeable about Burma and interested in Burma sort of per capita. But it's not like it's, the British are not racing out to make amends for colonialism. And so I don't see, you don't see them as really big players. I think they see themselves as having a particular authority when they speak on it, but I'm not sure that anybody else really agrees. But you had another part to your question? Yeah, I think you look at the region, because the hydropower is a tremendous opportunity. Agricultural, processed agriculture, Thailand next door. I think the Food and Agriculture Organization suggested that Thailand could feed 350 million people on its land. And their population in Thailand is about 70 million. So obviously agricultural exports are a huge thing for Thailand, And the geography, the ability to grow things in Burma is similar to Thailand. So I think that, you kind of look at what Thailand has done, and that's probably generally what Burma should do, but they actually have more resources per capita in Burma than they have in Thailand. But you've heard of the resource curse, where people who live in a place with lots of natural resources end up being very poor. The Niger Delta being the ultimate one, where they pulled out more oil and gas over decades and the people don't even have electricity who live there, So just having resources doesn't actually really help. And sometimes resource extraction ends up being very centralized and capital intensive, and people end up with not much. So, I think light manufacturing, tourism, and agricultural production be the three places that would be the best place to focus. But I'm not sure they will. It might be resource extraction. We're getting to the end, so...
We have time for a couple more questions. Are there any more? Okay, yeah, let's... Did someone have their hand up?
So I remember also a few years ago when you were here talking about the tensions between Burma and Bangladesh and the whole ethnic minorities type thing. Has that improved at all post-elections or in the last few years?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It is worth noting. In particular, along the Thai-Burma border, these areas, you have ethnic Mon people and then Karen people, and in those areas, things are substantially better than they were, so that there is generally no fighting. Yes, there's land grabs. There are local power brokers who are doing gold mining and polluting the local stream, and that means the local farmers are suddenly unable to farm their land. I mean, there are bad things happening, but nothing like the scale that it was. So yes, in Shan State, they're still fighting in some parts. Kachin State is worse than it was. And I would say the situation for the Rohingya is worse than it was. But for the most part, for most people, it's better than it was a few years ago, you know, yeah. So I guess in a certain sense, that encapsulates it. This is better than it used to be, but there are a lot of big problems, and in some places, those problems are quite severe still.
Okay, if there's no more questions, let's please give a round of applause to our speaker.
Thank you.
This has been pretty wonderful. Thank you, Larry.